You know what's lazier than a top 10 list? A top 6 list. And you know what's as lazy as a top 6 list? Me. So, that being the case, I now present to you my list of the top 6 fighting game series of all time. Ever since I first laid eyes on a Street Fighter II arcade cabinet, I knew that I would always love fighting games. And ever since that same cabinet devoured my coins in a matter of seconds as I lost round after round, I knew I would always be absolutely terrible at them. Nearly 30 years later, I can safely say that I was right on both counts. I still love fighting games more than just about every other genre, and I've spoken before about both my odd compulsion to buy as many of them as possible, and my complete inability to summon the focus and determination to stick with any one of them until I become even slightly competent. So remember as you watch this video that I am the very definition of a casual fighting game player, and my opinions should be considered with that in mind. That said, I'm also an advocate of the notion that a casual player's opinion can be just as valid as a hardcore player's. Well, of course I am. If I didn't believe that, I would never have started making these videos. Plus, since I've played so damn many fighting games, I feel at least somewhat qualified to make some comparisons. And although I said I've never stuck with one game long enough to become competent, over the years I've played each of these 6 series for at least 100 hours at the low end, and many hundreds of hours at the high end. And hey, ultimately these are just opinions. I completely understand if you see things differently, and I'd love to hear some of your perspectives in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. First up, at number 6, it's King of Fighters. Right, I really want to point out that this is a top 6 list, and just because King of Fighters is in last place, that doesn't mean I don't love it. I do. I love all the series on this list. But something had to come last, and I thought long and hard before deciding that it would be King of Fighters. If I was going to use one word to describe KOF, it would be solid. It's a little less flashy and a little more grounded in reality than the other series on this list, or at least the 2D ones. Of course, that's all relative. There are still fireballs and energy waves and gravity-defying explosions of mind-boggling gymnastic prowess, but it's all toned down a little compared to some of the games I'll be highlighting later on. Regardless, the combat feels great, with extremely solid fundamentals and a pleasing sense of rhythm and counterplay. The character designs are also somewhat more subdued than many other fighting games. KOF has boasted a huge roster of characters over the years, and most of them look essentially human, albeit humans from some sort of anime. They might almost seem bland compared to some of the more outlandish 2D fighters out there, but although I do tend to prefer characters who walk on the wilder side, I'm perfectly happy with King of Fighters' roster. What I'm not quite so happy with, and one of the reasons KOF occupies the bottom spot on this list, is the recent transition from 2D to 3D with King of Fighters 14. I know the developers had their reasons. Apparently they just couldn't find the budget for the meticulously crafted sprites that made KOF 13 such a gorgeous game. I can understand that. But I simply do not like the look of the most recent game in the series. It's not the fact that the characters are 3D that bothers me. I think other games have made the transition with a reasonable amount of success. But these 3D models seem like a real step back. The game still plays well, absolutely, but for someone like me, for whom the sheer spectacle of the over-the-top action is the main draw of fighting games, if I can't appreciate the look of a fighting game, I can't really appreciate the game itself. I do still love King of Fighters though, I just tend to stick with older games in the series. Okay, on to number 5, which is Street Fighter. I've spoken before about how completely, utterly and blindly I loved Street Fighter II when I was a kid, and how it's one of only 3 games that I would say I was truly obsessed with. If you told me then, at the height of my obsession, that nearly 30 years later Street Fighter would rank only 5th in my list of favourite fighting game series, I wouldn't have believed you. Of course I wouldn't have believed anything else you said about the future either. I was kind of an idiot at that age, but I wasn't quite so foolish as to believe random strangers claiming to have knowledge of the distant future. In this case though, yep, you'd have been right. Of course, I still absolutely love Street Fighter. For me, it's basically the fighting game equivalent of comfort food, something I'll load up every now and then in one form or another, just to wallow in the reassuring familiarity of it all. I don't think I'll ever get properly tired of hurling Hadokens or breaking jaws with a well-timed Dragon Punch, even though calling anything I do in fighting games well-timed would be a bit of a stretch. I still love the characters. I can still feel the faint stirrings of the fascination with them that caused me to dive into the world of writing fanfiction, a world that I haven't revisited since my teenage years, for better or worse. I still have a fondness for Dalsim, my first ever main. I still have a grudging respect for Zangief with his insanely powerful spinning pile driver that I, naturally enough, could never pull off. And Ryu, or Ryu, or whatever, sticks in my mind as the most iconic fighting game character of all time. And speaking of iconic, Street Fighter set the standard for an entire genre. Most good things that fighting games do these days were invented or at least popularised by the Street Fighter series. Okay, the first game in the series hasn't exactly stood the test of time, but Street Fighter 2 is the genesis of fighting games as we know them, and every game in the series since has refined its winning formula. Why, then, if I loved it so much and it continues to be excellent, is it only at number 5? Well, in some ways it's almost a victim of its own success. Like I say, it set the standard for the genre, and now that the genre is incredibly well established and has grown in new and interesting ways, being the standard just seems, well, pretty standard rather than exceptional. And even a winning formula can be refined too far, so that these days Street Fighter seems almost too simple and a little boring compared to its competition. Here's the thing, with Street Fighter V, I feel I can get a pretty good feel for a character in 20, maybe 30 minutes. Of course, there are infinite layers of skill and nuance beyond just getting a feel for a character, but for someone as terrible as me, even the lowest of those layers is essentially unattainable. So once I've spent half an hour with a character, I feel like my journey with them is done, that I've hit my skill ceiling. Yes, this is a problem that's a lot more to do with me than it is to do with the game itself, but that's why I put a doddering old man's perspective in the title of my videos. But I do objectively think that the series has been playing it a little too safe in recent years, and I hope the next entry takes a few more risks, maybe reinvents itself in the way Street Fighter 3 did. That game remains possibly my favourite in the series, mainly because it just stands out from the crowd. Well, on to number 4, which definitely stands out from the crowd even more. It is Guilty Gear. When I mentioned outlandish 2D fighters earlier, what I mostly had in mind was Guilty Gear. The characters in this series are imaginative, to say the least. You've got Ino, a witch with an electric guitar and a sentient hat. You've got Venom, an assassin whose moveset revolves around billiards. You've got Bedman, whose consciousness resides in a dream world, and so fights you while strapped to a bed that looks like it's been kitted out by Mad Max. And then there's Faust, possibly my favourite character due to his combination of lethal insanity and sheer wackiness, who fights with a giant scalpel, constantly wears a paper bag on his head, and whose finishing move involves giving opponents an unwanted facelift. It's truly creative stuff, but it would be meaningless if the visual designs didn't match the bizarre concepts, but they really, really do. The game always looked good back when the characters were 2D sprites, but the latest iteration is just amazing. The characters are now fully 3D, but rendered and animated in such a way as to retain a mostly 2D appearance. Only at moments of high action does the camera swing around to reveal the truth. Obviously, tastes will vary, and if you're not into the anime aesthetic, Guilty Gear may be a little too over the top for your tastes. But I personally consider it to be the best looking fighting game around. There's just so much style to it all. But again, all this would be meaningless if the fighting itself was bad. But again, it's not. At a fundamental level, it's all very solid. Basic attacks feel impactful, and characters move freely and fluidly, although perhaps a little more slowly than some other similar games. At a more advanced level, well, there's a lot there, and suffice it to say, many of the more sophisticated techniques are beyond my feeble fingers. It's worth noting, though, that the latest versions of the game include one of the best and most comprehensive tutorials in fighting game history, so even a noob like me can reach their maximum potential, as paltry as that potential may be. I think my favourite thing about Guilty Gear is the variety of the fighters, and more importantly how that variety creates very different experiences depending on who you're playing as. The roster of characters isn't as vast as some other series, but every character in the game feels like they bring something different to the table. And those differences tie in perfectly with the visual designs. You know that the more outlandish looking characters are going to require a bit more creative thinking if you want to master their movesets. Now, having heaped praise upon the series for taking the outlandish route, from my perspective it is also a minor downside. Because the characters are so unusual, and because their animations are so different to more standard fighting games, it can be difficult to visually read what's happening on the screen, at least until you're very familiar with the games. In Street Fighter, when a character punches, it's easily recognisable for what it is, and of course the designers of Street Fighter purposely made the characters' hands and feet somewhat oversized so that the action would be just that little easier to read. Guilty Gear makes no such concessions. Attacks can come from anywhere and in any form. Faust may slice you with his scalpel, or inexplicably turn into a baseball player and whack you with his bat. Bedman can plunge one of his mechanical arms into the ground only for it to appear behind you. Venom can place billiard balls all over the screen and then set them bouncing off in all directions. Things like this make Guilty Gear rather confusing for ultra-casual players like me, and I don't just mean when I'm the one playing. I love watching fighting game pros battle it out in the big tournaments, but I just find Guilty Gear too baffling to be truly enjoyable to watch when it's played at a high level. Ultimately, Guilty Gear is a little bit too daunting for someone like me. It's a testament to its incredible style and solid fundamentals that it nonetheless makes it to number 4 on this list. I strongly suspect that if I was a better player, it would be even higher. But I'm not. And so, at number 3, it's Soul Calibur. Of all fighting games, the first Soul Calibur may be the one I came closest to actually being good at. I never came very close at all, let me stress that, but for a brief period after the release of the Dreamcast, I was highly addicted to Soul Calibur, and I took the time and effort to try to properly understand the game mechanics. It was a game well suited to casual and unskilled players, as it was fundamentally rather simple and highly intuitive. There was one button for a horizontal attack, one for a vertical attack, and one for a kick. There were no real special moves as such, not in the traditional sense at least, just variants of basic attacks that could mostly be easily performed by pressing different directions on the stick. This meant that even if you were basically just button mashing, you could still have a reasonable idea of what your character was going to do when you bashed away randomly, and once you moved beyond that level, it wasn't too tough to remember the inputs for a wide array of moves. Of course, the focus on weapons-based combat sets Soul Calibur apart from the other games on this list. I remember being skeptical at first. The only other game I played that tried the same thing was Battle Arena Toshinden 2, of which I was not a huge fan. But Soul Calibur handled it so well, it really felt like a proper action movie duel. Probably the main reason for this was the animation, which was incredibly smooth and sophisticated for its time. The first game had katas for each character, which are just non-interactive demonstrations, but the animation was so lifelike and convincing that it was just like watching a real-life weapon master showing off their skills. I spent hours watching these katas, and yes, I admit it, trying to emulate them. If I'd been caught on camera, I'd basically be like that Star Wars kid from the ancient viral video, twirling a curtain rod around and pretending I was Killick, even though I possibly should have grown out of such things by then. Who am I kidding? I still haven't grown out of such things. I'd definitely still be prancing around and pretending to be Killick if I wasn't held back by crippling self-consciousness and a bad back. Anyway, Soul Calibur wasn't the first game to use motion capture for its animations, but it was the first one where I became truly aware of just how grounded in reality its animations were. You might notice I've largely been talking about the series in the past tense, and mainly been focusing on the first in the series. Well, the first apart from Soul Edge and Soul Blade on the PlayStation. This is a clue to why, despite the fact that Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast is one of my all-time favourite games, the series is still only at number 3 on this list. I've played all of the sequels, right up to the relatively recent Soul Calibur 6, and I've enjoyed them all, but the series hasn't really evolved all that much, not at a fundamental level at least. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The series remains as enjoyable and accessible as it always has been, but for me the pinnacle of the series was reached right at the start, and nothing has really matched its impact since. Now, at number 2 is a series that has definitely made a more recent impact on me. It is BlazBlue. There's a very easy way to summarise why I like BlazBlue so much. For me, it's the perfect combination of Street Fighter's solid fundamentals, with Guilty Gear's outlandish characters and advanced techniques. I find BlazBlue a lot more interesting in every department than Street Fighter's latest iterations, and rather more accessible and comprehensible than Guilty Gear. There's a huge variety of interesting and diverse characters here, but only a few of them, like Arakune, an amorphous shadow creature who turns invisible and summons bizarre creatures, are truly off the wall. Most of the characters are recognisable fighting game archetypes, but each of them have their own unique twist. The basic attacks are not too dissimilar from other fighting games, although they lean more towards Guilty Gear style anime flamboyance rather than something more grounded like King of Fighters. However, there is also a separate attack button that does something different for every character. For Taokaka, a cheerfully naive cat-like creature and possibly my favourite character, it's a relatively simple dash attack that can be launched in just about any direction. For Ragnar, the series' main protagonist, it's a powerful attack that leeches health from the opponent. For Rachel Alucard, and yes, you may have heard that surname before, it's not actually an attack at all, but a gust of wind that she can use to zoom around the battle arena with great speed, and which also affects enemies and their projectiles. Learning just the intricacies and proper usage of all these different abilities is quite a challenge, and that's not to mention the vast array of other special attacks that the different characters have access to. There are other games that are arguably more complex, but even so it's safe to say that BlazBlue games are pretty damn complicated, especially factoring in the large character roster, which stands at 36 in the latest game in the series. And yet I'd honestly say BlazBlue remains fairly accessible. The actual dexterity required to pull off most of the moves is not massive, and combos seem relatively forgiving when you're bashing away at the controller. It's worth mentioning at this point that the BlazBlue series is one of an increasing number of fighting games that offer a stylish mode, which basically allows you to perform special moves with the touch of a single button. Despite my self-confessed noobishness, I never use these modes, and I never will. As well as the sheer spectacle of fighting games, my main enjoyment of the genre comes from mastering a character's various abilities and figuring out how they may be best used. Well, mastering may not be the right word in my case, but I do like the simple challenge of pressing the right buttons on the controller at the right time. The process of actually fighting an opponent sometimes becomes almost secondary to me in terms of importance. I know I can never beat a skilled opponent, or indeed the CPU on the higher difficulties. Their speed and reflexes will always outclass mine. But if I can get to a point where I can nail a tricky combo with reasonable consistency, I find that genuinely satisfying. And BlazBlue's mechanics are pitched at just the right level that I find them challenging to get down, but not frustratingly so, making it a challenge I relish. I suspect I've spent almost as much time in BlazBlue's fairly comprehensive training and practice modes as I have fighting an actual opponent. There's only one fighting game with mechanics and gameplay that I find more enjoyable, and that is coming right up after these honourable mentions. NetherRealm games. Or, if you prefer, consider this a double entry for the Injustice and Mortal Kombat series. They're pretty similar in many ways, including the fact that I'm not a huge fan of either of them, although I have got some enjoyment from them, just, not that much. I find the combat clunky and the characters fairly dull, but I do think NetherRealm deserves a lot of credit for the work they put into the single-player aspects of their games. They feature a large variety of ways to play and also comprehensive story modes. I personally find the stories pretty uninteresting, but I appreciate the effort and I genuinely wish other fighting game developers would take a leaf out of NetherRealm's book. Marvel vs. Capcom. I can absolutely understand the appeal of this series, and I want to like it, I honestly do, but I've just never been able to get into it. A lot of that is to do with the fact that these are tag battles. I have enough trouble getting my head around one character, let alone 3 at a time. And everything just seems a little too frenetic. You can't go 5 seconds without the entire screen being filled with a giant barrage of fireballs or rockets or serve bots. I love the huge variety of characters, and I'm sure it's a great game once you reach a certain level of competence, but I have definitely never reached that level. Okay, at last it's time to reveal which fighting game series I consider to be the pinnacle of the genre. I suspect it won't be too much of a surprise for a lot of you. There's really only one major series I haven't mentioned yet. Well, there's Smash Brothers, I guess, but I know almost nothing about those games. No, the series I'm putting in the top spot is Tekken. There are so many things I love about Tekken. Probably the most significant of these is just how incredibly intuitive it is. Even more so than Soul Calibur, which I praise for the same reason. The 4 attack buttons correspond to the 4 limbs of your character, and just knowing this one simple fact is all you need to dive in and start having fun. Even if you're basically just mashing buttons, the fact that you have a general idea of what each of those buttons is going to do before you press them is enough to make you feel like you're genuinely playing the game, even if you really have no idea what you're doing. Just alternate between each of the punch buttons, for instance, and your character is likely to execute a fluent left-right-left combo, and you'll really feel like you did that deliberately and with perfect timing. It wasn't deliberate, of course, and there was nothing perfect about your timing, but dagnabbit if it didn't feel like it was. I believe Tekken is a game where it's possible to truly be a natural. If you have a good feel for the ebb and flow of combat, hell, even if you've just watched a whole heap of kung fu films, you'll flourish. And then, as you begin to pick up more of the basics, like the way directional inputs affect your attacks in a natural, comprehensible way, you'll feel like you're already making good progress on the road to mastery. That's an illusion, of course. There is so much nuance and subtlety to Tekken that it takes many hours to even begin to understand how much nuance and subtlety there is. And yet, despite this, everything seems as natural and intuitive as that first left-right-left combo. It just takes more skill and, importantly, more knowledge to pull off. Tekken is the first, and so far only, fighting game series where I've actually been motivated to learn about frame data. I gave up almost immediately, of course, when I realised just how much there was to wrap my head around, but at least I was inspired to make the effort. Of all the games on this list, Tekken would have to be the one most grounded in reality, which still isn't really saying much. You've got bears and pandas, and cyborgs and ninjas and cyborg ninjas, plus guest character Akuma from Street Fighter, who hurls fireballs around and is basically a rampaging demon. But is the exception rather than the rule, fireballs are not really a part of Tekken, and most of the moves of most of the characters are at least technically possible in real life, as has been demonstrated by several excellent videos elsewhere on YouTube. Indeed, almost all the characters' movesets are drawn from genuine martial arts, and some of the characters are based directly on real people. Anyone with even a casual interest in kung fu films will notice the similarities between martial law and Bruce Lee, and between Lei and Jackie Chan. The amount of variety on offer is huge, and despite how intuitive everything feels, there is a massive difference between the playstyles offered by the diverse range of characters. Steve, for instance, is a boxer who relies almost entirely on his fists alone. This could be limiting, but his ability to dodge and weave coupled with his huge range of unpredictable combos make him a truly versatile fighter, and possibly my favourite character in the game. On the other hand, Hwarong, another personal favourite of mine, specialises in Taekwondo and is most effective when his feet are flying. The differences between these two characters are not as superficially obvious as the differences between some of the more varied characters from BlazBlue, for instance, but their playstyles are poles apart, and the differences only become more apparent the more you play and the more skillful you get. Of all the fighting games, Tekken is also the one I enjoy watching the most, and I mean that even when I'm playing it. It's a spectacle, but it's one you really feel like you're part of. And one day, maybe, just maybe, I'll actually be good at it. I wouldn't count on it though. Well, thanks for watching. Do you agree with any of my entries on this list, or would you do things completely differently? Let me know in the comments. I always like hearing different perspectives on stuff like this. Until next time though, get off my lawn.
비슷할 것 같은 건 없어?